My mom was born in St. James, Port of Spain. She came from a family of 13 siblings. Her three youngest brothers were involved with an early steel band known as Red Army. They were involved in the early evolution of the steel bands and the early riots between steel bands. This rivalry resulted in her youngest brother being killed and his body dumped at sea near to the Mucurapo Road near to their home at the southern end of Matura Street. I wasn't born as yet. My mom was badly traumatized by this incident. She didn't want to continue living in the St. James community. She went to a Siparia Fete one year with a friend where she met my father. My father was employed as a well-servicing foreman and he was living in the TLL housing project in Palo Seco. TLL, Trinidad Leasehold Limited Company, was the major oil exploration company between 1940 to 1963. The predecessor to Texaco Trinidad Incorporated. The oil companies build houses at Forest Reserve in Palo Seco for some of their senior employees. They got married and she birthed 4 children in South. My father told me a lot about the butler struggle. He was a butlerite in the 1937 to 1945 period. As a young teenager in the mid-1960s, I became interested in the OWTU's fight for proper representation for the working class. I kept my links with my relatives in St. James. My elder brothers and I had a deep appreciation for steel band music. Against the wishes of my mom, my 2 elder brothers moved to St. James and started playing pan. I think this stress sent my mom to an early grave. She died in 1965 when I was in my early teens. I also began playing pan somewhere around 1967 when I moved to St. James. I was always in between Palo Seco, Faizabad and St. James. Because my grandmother lived in St. James, I considered St. James as my real home, my fallback home. The family went through a lot of dislocation, so we were here, there and everywhere. But I spent most of my youthful life in St. James. I was going into 21 during 1970. On Panka Street in St. James, there was a very militant block known as Block 4. I met Brian Jeffers there as a teenager growing up. We played pan together for a brief period. The younger members of the SO Tripoli, West Side Symphony, North Stars, all St. James steel bands, were part of the 1970 marches. During that early period of the marches, NJAC Corps leaders were the main actors. I did attend the February 26th march, but I didn't go into the cathedral. I was also in the march on Charlotte Street that was tear-gassed by the police. Since I was not part of NJAC, most times I was just an ordinary rank-and-file follower. The tear-gassing of the march on Charlotte Street was during the early part of March. I can't recall the exact date. But NJAC leadership abandoned that march. There were 2 trade unions which were active in the 1970 marches. Namely, the Transport and Industrial Workers Union, TWU, and the Oilfield Workers Trade Union, OWTU. This was mainly due to Clive Nunez from TWU, and George Weeks from OWTU. George would have had some supporters from Pointe-à-Pierre branch behind him. The bulk of the oil workers didn't support the 1970 mass movement. The movement got most of its support from the unemployed section of the working class. At the Charlotte Street March, it was George Weeks who placed a handkerchief over his nose and led the protesters back to Woodford Square. He had some choice words for the police before he dismissed the marchers. There were persons, provocateurs, who started looting stores, which give the police the excuse to dismantle the demonstration. That march was about 5,000 in numbers. Most of my comrades from St. James, Block 4 position was that of critical support for NJAC. The state began to panic at the increased participation of young people in these protests. Coming from the oil field, my position wasn't one of cultural nationalism. Yes, I wore my hair in afro and I did sport a bracelet on my left hand. But that was all. I never wore a dashiki. Even before 1970, there was a group in St. James called the Western United Liberation Front. This group was comprised of about 6 soldiers from the TNT regiment. These soldiers, most of them, were influenced by the politics of CLR James. Coming from the oil belt, I myself was influenced by certain leftist figures in the OWTU. There was a guy, Clive Phil, he was the education officer of the OWTU. He was a Marxist. He visited Cuba in 1967, and on his return he made a statement that the only solution is armed revolution. Oh yes, we were against the discrimination of black people in TNT. But we believed in class struggle. The PNM was a black government. NJAC was not a monolithic black nationalist organization. It was a front organization comprising of different ideological currents. Brian Jeffers himself was a member of WOLF. He was most influential in forming NUFF. He was from mixed parentage, East Indian mother and an African father. He couldn't relate to African cultural nationalism. He said in 1970 that he was fighting for a humanitarian cause. He was never part of NJAC as well. I think my upbringing would have unconsciously prepared me to accept class struggle rather than being a black power cultural nationalist. Firstly, I came from a poor working class background and I felt more comfortable with the ordinary guys on the blocks. At the age of about 7 or 8, my family left Palo Seco and moved to an agricultural community in Manzanola. It was a rural community called Sidhu Village 5 miles away from the Manzanola main road. It was a neglected community where my father's elder brother owned 7 parcels of lands, cocoa, coffee, citrus, and bananas. Mixed cultivation. But most importantly, this community was comprised of East Indians, Caribs, Cocoa Payals, and Africans. We had no electricity, no water, no access roads. We didn't even had shops. My father had moved on to being an ardent supporter of the PNM. My uncle was a Democratic Labour Party activist. My uncle's lands, several pieces, off the Sidhu Road, were off the road on mud tracks. Sometimes 1 and 2 miles. He, like most others, wanted access roads to bring out their farm produce. They wanted better prices for their cocoa, coffee, and bananas. They thought that the PNM government weren't performing. Agriculture was not prioritized. He had heated discussions with my father about how oppressive the PNM was. My uncle felt that the PNM leaders were representing the urban middle class and the rich. Secondly, one of the first demonstrations I attended was in the Palo Seco area. In 1967, British Petroleum, one of the 3 oil companies operating in South, wanted to retrench 3,500 workers. There was an OWTU protest march from Palo Seco to Santa Flora. I attended that demonstration even though I was not employed. This was militant stuff and I liked it. And thirdly, I was refused employment at Texaco, the company which took over from TLL. My father got blind on the job, yet they never gave me a job. Maybe it was a sort of instinctive vengeance against capitalism. Maybe. Yes. Maybe it was because of my Butlerite socialization. I was very angry with the rejection I got from the big bosses at Texaco. It started as a love for trade unionism, I suppose. My mom came from a hardcore PNM family. My elder brothers never supported my activism. Even my blind father thought that I was going too far. I had some younger cousins who were interested, but they migrated soon after the 1970s. My only support came from some of my close comrades in St. James and Faizabad. Several of my friends in Faizabad parents were Butlerites, and they were blocked from jobs in the oil belt too. During the 1937 strike, the company brought in scab labor to break the picket line. Most of these guys were brought in to replace striking workers. Some were beaten by the strikers for going to work. A lot of them came in from the smaller islands, and their children got preferential treatment and were employed. We were deliberately blacklisted. There was a guy at the labor office at Forest Reserve, who it would seem did a lot of background checks on who the oil company employed. If I was employed, maybe my name would not have been mentioned in TNT history. Maybe. I went to Telco, which was a state company. They were employing people from rioting steel bands. And I went there seeking employment. The bosses were a guy called Brewster and Ivan Williams. Ivan Williams was handpicked by Dr. Eric Williams. They only employed persons who were loyal to the PNM. I didn't fit that bill, so I was asked to come back and come back. The same thing happened on the port. TNT has always been who know you and not who you know. There was supposed to be an attempt by a group known as Coordinating Council to seize political power before the SOE. Some rebel soldiers were in the forefront of this movement. The bloc militants like myself were all geared up for it. But it fell through. Then the police start raiding the blocks and arresting people who they felt were involved in this abortive strike. We the militants fought back. Then the army mutinied. Rebel soldiers took over Tetron and crossed over the hills and were stationed at St. Barb's Hills. Brian Jeffers, the then leader of NUFF, joined them. They were planning to initiate armed struggle. Then LaSalle and Shaw gave the orders to these rebel soldiers to surrender. They surrendered to Commander Jeff Surrett and were promised an amnesty. The police knew Jeffers and Block 4 had contacts with the rebel soldiers. Arms and ammunition went missing from Tetron after the army mutiny. Some of those arms were in the hands of NUFF militants. There was a lot of armed confrontation on the blocks. So Guy Harewood, Brian Jeffers, John Beto, Adolphe de Messiah and several others became wanted men. NJAC had a defense shadow minister called Ambrose who had contacts in several villages. Soon after the SOE, Ambrose and Guy Harewood defected from NJAC. They felt that it was time to start the armed revolution. So the St. James, Dago Martin, Bossier, Laventil, San Juan, Faizabad, Point Fortin, Rio Claro, Tunapuna, Sandy Grande, and Arima etc. chapters of NUFF were established. We had several safe houses in all the above-named places. After St. James, Faizabad would have been another NUFF base area. There were several persons in these communities in whose homes NUFF members camped out. We rose up against the detention of NJAC leaders and the charging and detention of Rex LaSalle, Rafik and other rebel soldiers. And there were other bloc militants who were charged for being in possession of Molotov cocktails and subversive literature. You would also remember the commanding officer of the Coast Guard and the lead prosecutor of the rebel soldiers was shot and injured. NUFF militants were accused of these incidents. There were also attacks on the St. James and Belmont police stations during this heightened period of militant activities after the declaration of the SOE. Isn't that a bit difficult to answer? Maybe NUFF was the outcome of the state repression of the movement of the 1970s. I can't think about it in no other way. Let us assume that I was given a decent job at Texaco. Would I have been so angry with the status quo? And what about if the government had called in the protesters and opened the door to negotiations? Maybe things would have been different. Honestly, we really can't say. Jennifer and Beverly were still at school during the 1970 mass movement. Jennifer was attending St. George's College in Barataria. Beverly was at Providence High School in Port of Spain. Jennifer said they would skip classes and attend NJAC marches at times. In 1972, while doing the A-level subjects at Polytechnic Institute in St. James, she came across a NUFF member of the Boissiere unit. Jennifer was very intellectually inclined. Their elder brother studied at Harvard University and he was an avowed Marxist. He would have influenced Beverly and Jennifer's political orientation. I don't think it was his intention that they get involved in armed revolution. Jennifer, John Beto, Guy Harewood, and another sister known as Ruth were responsible for conducting ideological classes with the different chapters within NUFF. I think the police would have gotten information about Jennifer when John Beto was killed in February 1973. She ended up joining the brothers who were operating from the Northern Range. NUFF rented houses which were called safe houses. People who were wanted by the state would be able to meet here to discuss the organization's plans and projections. They were places not known to much people. Beverly was held in such a safe house where she was staying with a NUFF member who was injured in a firefight with the police. She eventually got married, at a church, to Guy Harewood's younger brother Alan Harewood, another member of the Boissiere unit. John Beto was really a brilliant guy within the organization. He felt that NUFF's urban units should build block cooperative to serve as the basic unit of the organization. So we had several of these block cooperatives. The block cooperative was an attempt to build a sustainable economic base while waging war against the state. This was done by Frelimo in Mozambique successfully. But here in TNT we didn't have the space for such an undertaking. And it was a difficult task to achieve considering that some of the political commissars were wanted by the police. Some of these blocks were involved in handicraft, while others were involved in agriculture. This was done to get members involved in some kind of sustainable project. At the same time, the ideological work would have involved studying the works of Marx, Walter Rodney, Fidel Castro, Stokely Carmichael and others. In 1971 we had a split in the ranks. I left St. James and went back to the south. I was based in Faizabad. I honestly found that the northern units were taking too much of a confrontational role towards the security forces. I did establish a unit in Faizabad and we, the Faizabad unit, wanted to take a different road. But maybe it was too late. We did team back up with the northern units. The Port of Spain-centric units, because the police were always up in their faces, saw the police as the main enemy. Being from the more tranquil countryside, we the Southerners saw the corporations as the enemy. So the attacks against the police did ease up a bit. I also wanted closer links with an emerging revolutionary organization, the National Liberation Movement. But they only materialized when most of the NUFF fighters died. I was there from the inception and I always tried to broker a truce between the ultra-radical hotheads and those who were a bit moderate. Honestly, I think we in the military arm of NUFF were isolating too many good brothers and sisters. On the military side we had to be safe. You weren't allowed to speak hard. We had a 24-hour watch. And we kept the weapons well serviced. On the political side we published our newsletter. It was known as the Freedom Fighter. We had to always keep meetings to trash out policies. What activities would isolate the organization and what activities would build the organization. In the early period of the organization some renegade elements attacked a dwelling house and stole from the occupants. They were thrown out of the organization. In the forest we never stole from people's gardens. And we had to be careful how we treated farmers whom we came in contact with. We always had weekly meetings with the Flats unit to work out strategy. The urban arm felt that since they were on the ground they should dictate the day-to-day running of the organization. We usually had very stormy meetings. We operated for a 3-year period after 15 of our members were killed. But constant police harassment forced us to disband the organization. While I never saw myself as a leader, the internet blogs described me as a leader. But I don't think that is something that I would feel proud saying. I never believed in blowing my own trumpet. What I would admit is that I tried my best to be committed and responsible. NLM was launched in 1975 after NUFF's defeat at the hands of the state. They were a Marxist-Leninist organization. They proposed a more scientific approach towards armed revolution. They felt that you must build a centralized communist-style party. A united front under the leadership of such a party and a people's army. They were heavily influenced by the Chinese Revolution and Chairman Mao. NUFF survivors, some of us, did join this political party. They were operating by means of underground cells. But they had propagandists in the trade union movement. One of their leaders, Russell Andalcio, was the education officer of the then Council of Progressive Trade Union, CPTU. CPTU was a labor federation comprising OWTU, TWU, Cane Farmers Association, and a few other trade unions. I got arrested for being a member in 1976. I was framed and thrown in jail. NUFF activists, including Jennifer and myself, made an ideological criticism of the Central Committee and we were expelled. But they came back later and said they moved too rash and wanted us to rejoin. I didn't rejoin. All the leaders were university grads. To be honest, Russell Andalcio was always in contact with NUFF. He was part of a Marxist fraction within NJAC. The leaders of NUFF, including myself, never used the term Black Power. Of course, we were waging a guerrilla war. Gang? We were never a gang. Most of the people who were involved in NUFF, the survivors, went on to live responsible and fulfilling lives. Clyde Haynes went to UWI and had a master's degree. Andrea Jacob did a degree in sociology and got a prestigious government job. Jennifer did an agricultural program and then graduated as a doctor in Cuba. She went on to be a minister and an ambassador. Terrence Thornhill is an ordained minister in a Christian church, and I had a management job at a state enterprise and was a director at a state special purposes company for 6 years. I can go on and on. Gangsters don't even try to make a contribution to society. I rest my case. I had it very rough. I was shot in Montevideo in the North Coast in early April 1974. The police placed me on ID parades on the 10th and 11th of April. They placed me on about 24 parades, but no one pointed me out. Alec Heller, the commissioner in charge of crime in those days, told me that most of the people made me out and just didn't want to point me out. He told me that I should join a church because Christ was with me. But they did frame me with several charges. Shooting 3 policemen in the St. James in 1972. Possession of arms and ammunition, shooting to murder, and a $95,000 robbery with aggravation. I spent about 4 months in which I was remanded in custody. Then they arrested me again in 1976 and again threw me in prison. They would revoke my bail over and over. I won my last case in 1993, about 20 years later. I conduct my own defense in court and they hated me for that. I don't have any conviction. I won all my cases. What I think no one ever take note of is the fact that the armed forces didn't want Guy Harewood and John Beto to be captured alive. They learned from the Cuban playbook where Castro was captured alive. He went on to lead a successful revolution. Boros said that he didn't want those guys alive. Guy was cornered in a house with Terrence Thornhill. Guy was killed and Thornhill was held alive. Guy was a national symbol of revolution. They tear-gassed the house with John Beto and others. They were disoriented and the police could have captured them alive. Both Guy and Beto were revolutionary intellectuals. They didn't take any chance to leave them alive. Just might take it. Most of what was said about the 1970 mass movement was distorted. I think even though the NJAC banner was Indians and African Unite, people felt that the movement was an Afro movement. So I think although the urban and semi-urban Afro-Trinidadians could have related to it, the other ethnic groups could not relate to it. People still feel that the movement was about Africanizing the TNT population. Even when NJAC wanted to take part in the electoral process, the African boogie was thrown at them. In 1965, sugar workers didn't want Badhace Maharaj leadership and they went to George Weeks and the OWTU for help to settle industrial matters. The PNM government declared a SOE in the sugar belt. Dr. Williams is on record of having said that his greatest contribution was to keep oil and sugar apart because if they mixed it would become sweet oil. Please read his book Inward Hunger. We just can't deal with the fact that TNT is a hybrid country. This is the sad dichotomy.